many slides, so hopefully this will be just more conversational. My name's Nithila. I go by Nithila. I'm a writer based in Brooklyn, New York, by way of a smaller town in New York. And today I'm going to talk about creative nonfiction. And I have titled this little segment, Initiation and Experimentation with the I, as in that afflicted letter that we all use to talk about ourselves. So the first part, talking about initiation, and I'm going to focus on the tool that helped me the most, I would say, both personally and as a writer, and it's called Morning Pages. For fans of Julia Cameron, you may be familiar with it. It's a style of journaling where you sit down in the morning and you fill 3 pages of notebook paper, handwritten, and you can write anything at all. And you can write words that also mean nothing. There's no wrong way to do it. So you can sit down and write what you ate for breakfast, how you slept the night before. If you don't know what to write, you just write, I don't know what to write, until you've hit 3 pages. Morning Pages focuses on quantity over quality. It's about getting into a state of flow. It's a meditation, and I started doing it during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when there was all of that indoor time. And I found that it held up parts of me to the light that were otherwise very subconscious. So we all have instincts and gut feelings, emotions, a lot of things in our bodies that don't make it to language, they don't make it into thoughts, or they don't make it into speech. And Morning Pages, this stream of conscious approach to just essentially brain dumping or word vomiting, gives language to all of that. And I found it a really powerful way to connect with myself and to get to know myself in a way that, for all of us, the demands of everyday life don't necessarily ask us to know ourselves really, really deeply. So the process was transformative for me, again, personally and as a writer, in terms of becoming in touch with myself, more self-aware, and as I said, revealing a lot of those hidden parts that don't make it to light or into language. The second thing that Morning Pages did is it made use of the I. You have to speak from a place of self. And that is a very powerful place to speak from, and I became increasingly interested in writing that spoke from a place of I. Long before I was writing, or I did write, I knew that I needed to write. It was kind of a gut feeling or an instinct. I just, like a light switch, I had always been a lifelong reader, and one day I realized my life would not be fulfilled unless I did this thing. Whether I loved it or hated it almost didn't matter. And so Morning Pages, for me, made writing something that was a lot closer to myself. It didn't need to be these distant characters off doing something. It could actually come from a much closer place to my person. And so I'm going to move into the second part of this little chat, which is on experimentation. So creative nonfiction can include a lot of different things. People are often most familiar with memoir, but it can also take forms of poetry, essays, philosophy, types of criticism, political writing. It can really have a large span. And I'm really interested in writers that write from a place of themselves, but with unconventional structure. And there's a lot of really brilliant books that do that. So we go from this set journaling, open canvas, essentially, to now writing from a place of the self with a format that has an external gaze. Morning Pages are not meant to be read by anyone. They're not even meant to be reread by you if you don't want to. But when you write a book, you have a reader and an audience in mind. And so what do you do with the self when you're thinking about a reader? And I've got a few examples of books that I've been reading or revisiting here, and I'm going to read from one of them, just for us to all get a sense before I keep chatting. So this is one of my favorites. It is Bluets by Maggie Nelson. Is anyone familiar? Okay, great. So this is a book, it's a very short collection of what we would consider creative nonfiction, or like a lyric essay, some people call it, and it is about her love for the color blue. And it's also about heartache and some other things that were just happening in her life while she was writing this book about blue. So I will stop talking and encourage everyone to listen to how she speaks from herself, but also how she's going to talk about, in this case, a lot of philosophy and other artists in the work. Okay. 1. Suppose I were to begin by saying that I had fallen in love with a color. Suppose I were to speak this as though it were a confession. Suppose I shredded my napkin as we spoke. It began slowly, an appreciation and affinity. Then, one day, it became something more serious. Then, looking into an empty teacup, its bottom stained with thin brown excrement coiled into the shape of a seahorse, it became somehow personal. 2. And so I fell in love with a color, in this case, the color blue, as if falling under a spell I fought to stay under and get out from in turns. 3. Well, and what of it? A voluntary delusion, you might say, that each blue object could be a kind of burning bush, a secret code meant for a single agent, an X on a map too diffuse ever to be unfolded in entirety, but that contains the knowable universe. How could all the shreds of blue garbage bags stuck in brambles, or the bright blue tarps flapping over every shanty and fish stand in the world be, in essence, the fingerprints of God? I will try to explain this. 4. I admit that I may have been lonely. I know that loneliness can produce bolts of hot pain, a pain which, if it stays hot enough for long enough, can begin to simulate, or to provoke, take your pick, an apprehension of the divine. This ought to arouse our suspicions. 5. But first, let us consider a sort of case in reverse. In 1867, after a long bout of solitude, the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé wrote to his friend Henri Cazalis. These last months have been terrifying. My thought has thought itself through and reached a pure idea. What the rest of me has suffered during that long agony is indescribable. Mallarmé describes this agony as a battle that took place on God's bony wing. I struggled with that creature of ancient and evil plumage, God, whom I fortunately defeated and threw to earth, he told Cazalis with exhausted satisfaction. Eventually, Mallarmé began replacing le ciel with l'azur in his poems, in an effort to rinse references to the sky of religious connotations. Fortunately, he wrote Cazalis, I'm quite dead now. 6. The half-circle of blinding turquoise ocean is this love's primal scene. That this blue exists makes my life a remarkable one, just to have seen it. To have seen such beautiful things, to find oneself placed in their midst, choiceless. I returned there yesterday and stood again upon the mountain. Okay, so that gives you a glimpse of how the I in creative nonfiction, though it is strengthened by writing from a place of subjectivity, it doesn't have to be as lonely or as all-telling as it might seem. And it's something that each of us has, whether it exists in a meditative practice, in your personal writing, or something that can be made to stand on its own, an I that can be filled with other people and other things. Okay, that's all. Yes?
As a writer, how do you write? What is your process?
It's a great question. And part of what I'm figuring out here, I think personally what I've learned about myself is I have to get really loose and I have to get into a state of flow, and that I often have to think back to that morning pages flow where I'm not editing, I'm not self-critiquing, I'm not going back and read the last 3 words that I just read 100 times. So it's important to write messy and to write with abandon, and then I go back and I figure out where the connections and like the magic are.
So do you do that handwritten, or do you do it on a computer?
Both, yeah. Sometimes a computer, I feel a little bit more free, but I think my favorite way to write is with just a pen and paper. Yep. Yeah. I'm not trained as a writer any more than all of us have been trained. So the 5-paragraph essay, or starting with your second most powerful argument, and then your weakest, and then your most powerful, the sort of grade school rules. I think I avoided writing essays in college because I found them very hard and dense and difficult to understand. But I am interested in feeling free when I write, and so I'm very drawn to writing that feels free. And I think genre is one way sometimes I feel trapped, and that I think something like creative nonfiction, though you could argue it's a genre in itself, it kind of breaks free of that. You know, you can use the symbols and the images and the philosophy, like you can pull a lot of things together. So I think that freedom is what I'm seeking with this format.
I'm really interested in your flow state.
Mm.
And can you talk more about what that is? What that like feels like in your body or your brain, or like what's the sensation for you?
I think it's not thinking that much. Like, it's not thinking too hard about the writing, it's just kind of letting it come out. It's almost like I'm trying to get words on the page before I'm thinking too hard about the words, because the thinking is when like your inner critic and all of that stuff can come in. So I think I'm trying to do it almost like instinct, as opposed to a filtered, curated process. And I think it feels satisfying. I think even if I look back and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to use any of that, it never feels like wasted time. The way morning pages, even though I have, dozens of notebook pages full of stuff, I may or may not ever go back and read that, but not a second of it was wasted. And so I think for me, the block is leaning into producing versus perfection.